Have you ever spent your entire life trying to earn the approval of people who only saw your flaws? I did for 40 years. I tried everything to make my parents proud. But no matter how successful I became, I was never enough for them. They wanted a perfect daughter who followed their rules. Instead, they got me a woman who built her own real estate company from the ground up, but they didn't see ambition, they saw rebellion. And when I divorced my cheating husband, they didn't stand by me, they stood by him. Then on my father's 80th birthday, they humiliated me in front of the whole family. They erased me from their will and from their lives. 3 years later, they came begging for help. Desperate, helpless. They didn't know I was the last person they should have crossed. Because when they walked into that luxury nursing home, the staff greeted me as the owner. What would you do if your parents disowned you, then needed you to save them? Stay with me because this is how I turned heartbreak into something they never expected. And if you enjoy real stories of betrayal and redemption, don't forget to subscribe to Outlaw Alley. I grew up in a house where love felt conditional. If you followed the rules, if you fit the mold, they showed you affection. If you dared to be different, you were met with silence or worse, disappointment. My parents were traditional, proud Bostonians. My father ran a small accounting firm, and my mother stayed home managing the family image like it was her full-time job. In their eyes, success had a formula: good grades, a respectable degree, a stable career, preferably in medicine or law, and of course, a perfect marriage. My younger brother Daniel was exactly what they wanted. He became a doctor, married young, had 2 beautiful kids, and never once questioned their expectations. He was the golden child, the one they bragged about at every family gathering. And then there was me, Margaret. From a young age, I knew I didn't fit their blueprint. I was ambitious, yes, but on my own terms. I didn't want to be a doctor or a lawyer. I wanted to build something that was mine. Real estate fascinated me, the idea of turning nothing into something valuable. By the time I was 30, I had my own investment company. By 40, I was financially independent. But to my parents, none of that mattered. They saw my success as unstable, risky, unbecoming of a proper woman. Every phone call felt like a performance review. I was destined to fail. Why can't you be more like your brother? Are you sure this business thing is wise? And when I got married, I thought finally they'd approve. He was charming, well-spoken, from a good family. For a while, they did treat me like I was worthy. But when I found out he was cheating on me repeatedly, and I filed for divorce at 45, everything changed. I remember sitting across from my parents expecting maybe not comfort, but at least understanding. Instead, my mother sighed and said, "Margaret, if you weren't so difficult, maybe he wouldn't have strayed." And my father, he just shook his head, disappointed. Not in him, but in me. That was the moment I realized I would never be enough for them. Not because I failed, but because I refused to live by their rules. Still, part of me kept hoping, kept showing up for holidays, birthdays, pretending that maybe one day they'd see me for who I really was. But that hope shattered completely on my father's 80th birthday. The whole family was gathered, cousins, uncles, everyone. My father stood up to make a toast. He spoke about legacy, family values, and then casually announced that he and my mother had updated their will. Everything. The house, the savings, the heirlooms would go to Daniel and his children. He didn't even look at me when he said it. It was like I was invisible. I sat there numb, while the room awkwardly sipped their champagne. No one said a word to me, not even Daniel. After that night, I made a decision. If they could erase me from their family, I could erase the need for their approval. I walked away, not just from them, but from the years of chasing validation. I poured everything into my business, expanding beyond what I ever thought possible. I bought properties across Massachusetts, including a struggling chain of nursing homes that no one else wanted. It wasn't revenge, at least not then. It was survival. It was me proving to myself that I didn't need them to succeed. But fate has a strange sense of humor, because 3 years later, they would walk right back into my life, on my terms. It's funny how life can turn tables when you least expect it. For 3 years after that birthday humiliation, I didn't hear a word from my parents. No calls, no letters, nothing. And honestly, I was fine with that. I stayed busy, too busy to dwell on the past. My company was thriving. I'd turned that struggling nursing home chain into a profitable business by focusing on premium care. It felt good building something meaningful, something that actually helped people. But then, one afternoon I got a call. It wasn't from my parents, it was from Daniel. I hadn't spoken to him much since that night. He was always the dutiful son, the one who followed orders. So when I saw his name flash on my phone, I almost didn't answer. But curiosity got the better of me. "Margaret, hey?" He started his voice unusually tense. I could tell immediately this wasn't a social call. After a bit of awkward small talk, he got to the point. Our parents' health had declined rapidly. Dad had suffered a minor stroke, and Mom was struggling to manage on her own. They needed to move into a care facility soon. I waited for him to mention their perfect insurance plan, or how he, the golden child, had it all handled. But instead, he sighed and said, "They want to go somewhere nice, but their insurance won't cover the type of place they're asking for." I could almost hear the unspoken words they expected me to pay. After everything, after disowning me, now they needed my help. I asked him, "Why are you calling me Daniel? You're the one they trusted with everything." His silence said it all. He didn't want to dip into his own savings, and despite being their chosen heir, he wasn't willing to shoulder their burden. Eventually, he admitted, "Look, they asked if you could, assist. Just this once?" I didn't say yes, I didn't say no, I simply told him I'd think about it. But deep down, I already knew my answer. A week later, I arranged a meeting with my parents at the facility they were hoping for, an upscale nursing home known for its luxury accommodations and top-tier care. When I walked into the lobby, I saw them sitting there, older, frailer, but still carrying that air of superiority. They barely greeted me, as if they were doing me a favor by accepting my help. My mother immediately launched into a list of demands: the type of room they wanted, dietary preferences, daily activities. My father, quieter but no less proud, simply nodded along. I listened, calm, composed. And then, the moment arrived, the facility manager approached us with a warm smile and said, "Ms. Wilson, everything is prepared as per your instructions. If your parents would like, we can give them a tour before finalizing their stay." My mother looked confused. "Per her instructions?" she asked. The manager glanced at me, still smiling. "Of course, as the owner, Ms. Wilson has ensured that every detail meets her standards." The silence that followed was delicious. My parents stared at me, first in confusion, then in realization, and finally in disbelief. I met their gaze without saying a word. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the daughter begging for approval. I was the woman holding all the cards. They didn't say much during that tour. I could see the storm of emotions behind their eyes, pride swallowed by shock, entitlement bruised by reality. When we sat down to discuss the terms, I made it clear they would receive the best care, but it wouldn't come without conditions. I told them, "If I'm going to help you, we're doing this my way. That includes weekly family therapy sessions, no exceptions." My mother's face hardened. My father scoffed. "That's unnecessary," she snapped. "We don't need—" I raised my hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "You need a place to stay. I'm offering one with strings attached. Take it or leave it." They weren't used to being given ultimatums, especially not from me, but they also knew they had no other options. After a long, tense pause, my father finally muttered, "Fine." And just like that, the game had changed. The first therapy session was exactly what I expected: awkward, cold, and filled with denial. They sat across from me in that small, comfortable room, arms crossed, faces stiff like stone statues. The therapist, a gentle woman named Dr. Harris, tried to ease us in with simple questions, but my parents treated it like a formality, something to endure, not engage with. "We don't have issues," my mother said flatly. "Margaret is just sensitive." I felt my jaw tighten, but I didn't respond. Not yet. Dr. Harris asked them to talk about that night, my father's birthday. My father shrugged as if it was nothing. "We made a decision about our estate. It wasn't personal." Not personal. They erased me from their lives in front of everyone and called it business. For weeks, it was the same pattern. They deflected, dismissed, minimized. Every wound, like it was all in my head. But I showed up every single session. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I let the silence after their words hang heavy in the room, forcing them to sit with the weight of what they'd done, and slowly cracks began to show. It was during the 5th session when Dr. Harris asked a simple question: "Why did you feel the need to disown your daughter?" My mother opened her mouth ready with another rehearsed answer. "But my father..." He hesitated. For the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes, something that looked a lot like guilt. He cleared his throat and said, "Margaret was always difficult to understand." Dr. Harris pressed gently. "In what way?" He glanced at me, then looked away. "She reminded me too much of my sister. That caught me off guard. I barely knew anything about my aunt, just whispers of family tension." Dr. Harris asked him to explain, and that's when the truth started to unravel. His sister, my Aunt Eleanor, had been a successful businesswoman back in the day. Ambitious, independent, and unapologetic. She'd built a company from scratch, just like I had. But instead of admiration, my father resented her. He always felt overshadowed, inadequate compared to her achievements. When I looked at Margaret, he admitted quietly, "I saw Eleanor. The same defiance, the same need to prove herself. It wasn't defiance, it was determination. But to him, they were one and the same." My mother sat in silence, processing his words. For once, she didn't jump to his defense. The next few sessions were raw. Years of buried resentment, misunderstandings, and pain spilled out. They spoke about expectations, about fear, about how they believed they were protecting me by pushing me to conform. "We thought if you followed the path we set, you'd be safe." My mother finally confessed, "But when you chose your own way, we didn't know how to handle it." Hearing that didn't erase the hurt. But it gave me something I'd never had before: clarity. By the 10th session, the walls between us weren't completely down, but they were no longer impenetrable. My father, once too proud to admit any fault, looked at me and said, "I was wrong, Margaret, about a lot of things." Those 6 words held more weight than any apology could. This was the point of no return. There was no pretending the past hadn't happened, no sweeping it under the rug like they always did. We had dragged every ugly truth into the light, and now we had to decide what to do with it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing their approval. I was offering them a chance, not for my sake, but for theirs, because forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to move forward even when the scars remain, and they knew if they wanted to be part of my life again, it would be on honest terms, not the ones they tried to dictate for decades. After that breakthrough in therapy, I knew this wasn't over. An apology was a start, but words were easy. Change, that was the real test. I didn't want revenge in the way people imagine it. Cold, cruel final. I wanted something far harder to achieve: accountability, respect, and if possible, closure. So I made a plan. If my parents truly wanted my help, if they wanted to stay in that luxury facility under my roof, they'd have to earn more than just a place to sleep. They'd have to prove they could see me for who I really was. I scheduled weekly dinners at the nursing home's private dining room, not as a dutiful daughter, but as an equal. These weren't social visits. They were conversations with purpose. At first, they treated them like obligations, polite small talk, avoiding anything real, but I refused to let them fall back into old habits. One evening, I brought a stack of portfolios with me, documents showcasing the properties I'd acquired, the businesses I'd turned around, the people I'd employed. I laid them out on the table and said, "You spent years doubting my choices. It's time you see exactly what those choices built." My father flipped through the pages silently, his eyes scanning numbers, growth charts, photos of properties he'd probably driven past without knowing they were mine. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she looked at a newspaper clipping featuring an article about my company's success. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, my father looked up and asked, "Why show us this now?" I met his gaze and replied, "Because I don't need your approval anymore, but I do need you to understand that I was never reckless. I was never a failure. I was exactly who I was meant to be. It wasn't about bragging. It was about rewriting the narrative they'd forced on me for decades." Over the next few weeks, those dinners shifted. They started asking questions, not the condescending kind, but genuine curiosity. They wanted to know how I managed during the recession, how I handled difficult clients, how I kept growing when others folded. For the first time, they saw me not as their rebellious daughter, but as a capable woman who had built something they couldn't ignore. But I didn't stop there. I suggested we revisit the past, not to dwell but to understand. I asked them about their childhoods, their fears, the pressures they faced. I wanted to know why they clung so tightly to control, why they feared independence in their children. Those conversations weren't easy. There were tears, especially from my mother, who admitted she'd always been afraid I'd end up alone, struggling if I didn't follow the safe path. "We thought we were protecting you," she whispered one night. "But I see now we were just protecting our own fears." Little by little, they began to change, not dramatically, but enough to notice they stopped referring to Daniel as the successful one. They stopped offering backhanded compliments or subtle jabs at my choices. And then they did something I never expected. One afternoon, they called me to their room. On the table was a folder, their updated will. "We revised it," my father said quietly. "Not because you need anything from us, but because it was wrong to erase you in the first place." I opened it, scanning through the pages. They'd split everything equally between me and Daniel. But more importantly, they'd added a letter handwritten addressed to me. In it, they acknowledged every misstep, every unfair judgment, every moment they failed to be the parents I deserved. It wasn't about the inheritance. It was about recognition. About finally being seen, not as a disappointment, but as their daughter, and as a person worthy of respect. I could have walked away years ago, and part of me still wonders if I should have. But standing there holding that letter, I realized something. This wasn't just about them changing. It was about me taking control of my story on my terms. I didn't need revenge. I needed resolution, and I had it. It was a rainy afternoon when the real breakthrough happened. Not in a therapy session, not over a formal dinner, but in the quiet of my parents' room. When neither of us expected it, I had stopped by to check in like I usually did. By then our conversations had become easier, less guarded, but there was still a distance, an invisible line we hadn't fully crossed. My father was sitting by the window watching the rain. My mother was organizing old photo albums, something she did often these days. As I was about to leave, my father spoke, his voice softer than I'd ever heard. "Do you ever wonder what things would have been like if we'd supported you from the start?" I froze. That wasn't a question I expected from a man who had spent most of his life pretending he was always right. I turned to him and said, "Every day." My mother looked up, tears already welling in her eyes. She reached for a photo. It was of me at my college graduation. I remembered that day vividly. They barely smiled in the picture because I wasn't going to med school like they wanted. "We were so proud of Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but we never told you how proud we should have been of you." For a moment, the weight of decades hung between us. Unspoken regrets, missed opportunities, words that should have been said long ago. I sat down, feeling emotions rise. I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. "Why now?" I asked quietly. "Why did it take losing everything, losing me for you to see it?" My father didn't look at me. He just stared out the window and said, "Because sometimes pride blinds you until there's nothing left but the truth." Silence filled the room, but it wasn't the cold, suffocating silence I grew up with. It was heavy, but honest. My mother reached over and took my hand, something she hadn't done since I was a child. "We can't change the past, Margaret," she said, her voice cracking. "But we want to spend whatever time we have left making things right." I searched their faces, both worn by age, by stubbornness, by years wasted on expectations, and in that moment I realized this was as close to redemption as they could give me. It wasn't perfect, it would never erase the hurt, but it was real. I nodded slowly and said, "I'm not doing this for the inheritance. I never was. I built my life without it." My father finally turned to me, his eyes glassy. "We know. And that's exactly why we respect you now." That word respect meant more than any apology. In the weeks that followed, something shifted. Our interactions weren't forced anymore. We laughed genuinely for the first time in years. They asked about my projects, my future plans, not to criticize, but because they truly wanted to know. Daniel visited occasionally, but even he noticed the change. One day he pulled me aside and said, "I don't know how you did it, but they talk about you differently now." I just smiled, because I knew this wasn't about changing them. It was about standing firm until they had no choice but to see me for who I really was. But life doesn't wait for perfect endings. A few months later, my father's health took a turn for the worse. When he passed, I was there holding his hand, not out of obligation, but because I chose to be. At his memorial, my mother stood beside me, not as the woman who once disowned her daughter, but as a mother who had finally found peace with her. She lived another year after that, and during that time we shared more honest moments than we had in the previous 40 years combined. When she passed, I wasn't left with bitterness, I was left with closure. And as I stood in the office of the nursing home I owned, looking out over the place where so much had changed, I felt something I never thought I would. Not revenge, not triumph, but calm. Because in the end, I didn't just survive their rejection, I transformed it. And they left this world knowing their daughter wasn't the failure they once believed, but the strongest person they'd ever known. Looking back now, I realize I spent far too many years believing that my worth depended on other people's approval, especially my parents. I thought if I worked harder, achieved more, stayed quiet when it hurt, one day they'd finally see me, finally love me the way I needed. But life doesn't work that way. Some people are too blinded by their own fears, their own pride, to recognize what's right in front of them until it's almost too late. I used to think being disowned was the worst thing that could happen to me, but in truth, it was the moment I was set free, free to define myself, free to succeed without waiting for applause that would never come. When they walked back into my life, desperate and vulnerable, I had a choice. I could have turned them away. And maybe years ago I would have, but strength isn't about revenge. It's about standing tall, knowing exactly who you are, and choosing grace when you hold all the power. I didn't help them because they deserved it. I helped them because I deserved peace. In the end, I didn't just rebuild a relationship, I reclaimed my story. They left this world understanding the woman I had become. Not because they shaped me, but because I thrived in spite of them. And that's the lesson I carry with me. You don't need anyone's permission to be proud of who you are. Not your family, not society, not anyone. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving others wrong, it's knowing you were right to believe in yourself all along. What would you have done differently if you were in my place? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories of resilience and redemption here on Outlaw Alley.